Good day, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Under the Cupola, where I, Leon Gaumond, the town manager here in the town of Weston, get to meet some of the people who make Weston the great place that we have here in town. And today, we are joined by Jordan McCarron, who is our Conservation Administrator. Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be
So
here.
you have been here for a few years. Tell me a little bit about yourself, how you ended up here, and what made you choose conservation as your field of expertise.
Sure. Again, Jordan McCarron, Conservation Administrator. I started in May of 2021.
Right in the middle of COVID.
So right in the middle of COVID, I directly came from the town of Westboro, where I was a conservation director for just over a year. And then the town of Weston, this opportunity came up and I had to jump on it. And I can explain, I have a connection to Weston. And before that, I was with the town of Lexington as the conservation assistant for about 7 years. I have a master's in environmental studies from Antioch Graduate School. And then going way back, in undergraduate, I studied journalism actually and history. And then, as life takes you, I developed other interests, and here I am. So going sort of back before I got into municipal conservation work, I was working on an organic farm in Lincoln, and from that job, I sort of got involved with Landsake here in Weston, and started in 2010 as the conservation land manager for Landsake. Now at that time, Landsake held the contracts to manage the trails, the fields, and all of the open space in Weston. So because I was the staff person at Landsake, I got to know my predecessor, Michelle Grisenda, who was the longtime conservation administrator before me. And she actually is the one that sort of got me interested and even got me aware of municipal work. I was unaware that, you could work for a town, that this could be a profession and a career. So when I finished graduate school in 2012, I got together with Michelle for dinner and said, what can I do? And she gave me a couple of job postings, one of which was for Lexington. So I started in Lexington and then, got experience over those 7 years, moved over to Westboro right at the beginning of the pandemic in April of 2020. So it was a challenging year for many reasons. And then Michelle called me when she ended up getting the job in Lincoln. She went over to Lincoln and vacated this position. She called me and said, you should think about applying. And I did, and here I am.
Yeah, great. And you've been enjoying it, hopefully?
Very much so.
Oh,
yeah,
good.
So, through my work at Landsake, albeit a decade ago at this point, I was familiar with some of the people. I was very familiar with the land and kind of with the goals and the mission of conservation in Weston. So it was a great fit.
Yeah. So tell me about conservation. Like, what does your department in Weston do? Why is there a conservation department under the roof of Town Hall?
Sure.
What do you folks do?
So you can think about it kind of in sort of two parts to it. The main part is the administration of the state's Wetlands Protection Act, and we now have a local wetlands bylaw in Weston that we passed at town meeting in 2023. So the Conservation Commission exists to help administrate that Wetlands Protection Act, and residents who live, who have wetlands on their property or wetlands near their property and are subject to the Conservation Commission's jurisdiction through the Wetlands Protection Act would be familiar with it. Those residents may have needed to come before the Conservation Commission to file a permit through the Wetlands Protection Act to do work on their property. It's a way for the town, through its Conservation Commission, to ensure that the wetlands are being protected and that the sort of the public benefits that wetlands provide us are being protected for future generations.
So if I was a resident, how would I know that I need to go and talk to you folks?
Sure. So usually the way it works is, you want to do some work on your property and you realize you're going to need some permits, maybe a building permit, maybe a permit through the Board of Health for your septic system, maybe a permit through the DPW for a stormwater upgrades or something like that. And through that process of just approaching the town and starting to figure out what permits you need, I will usually be able to look at that project or that proposal and say, there's wetlands here or close enough where, the project would be under the jurisdiction of the Conservation Commission, and then I get involved that way.
So, can somebody at home go on the town's website and determine if they have wetlands near or on their property?
Good question. Yes, you can, or yes, they can. So we have a great online GIS tool on the town website. I think it might even be on the homepage, but it's right there. You type in your address, and then you're going to get a lot of information related to your property. One of which is what we call a wetlands layer. Just a note about that. That data comes from the state. It has not been what we call ground truthed. In other words, when you look at that wetland data layer, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone has been on your property taking soil samples and vegetation samples. It's a great place to start. The state uses aerial photography, soils data, and they look at topography, et cetera. But it's not like a fine-tooth comb that someone has taken to your property. So that's a great place to start. And then from there, if it looks like you're going to need wetland permitting, then I will advise you or your consultant on sort of how to go about the process.
So outside of compliance with wetlands protection,
Yes.
you folks deal with a lot of
Right.
other stuff
We do, indeed.
regarding conservation-related issues. Tell me a little bit about some of those
Good.
things.
I could be more articulate on this side. When this is the fun side, and I think is why anybody that is in my position. By the way, all 351 towns in Massachusetts, cities and towns, have a conservation commission. Not all have paid staff. Some have part-time staff. I am lucky personally, and I think Weston is lucky to have a full-time, administrator and I have some part-time staff too, which I can talk about. But usually the permitting is not what draws people. It's the protection of the town's natural resources. And that's our other big job. By natural resources, I mean, obviously all the wetlands through the Wetlands Protection Act, but all of the conservation land in town.
So you have conservation land that you folks manage
Correct.
and operate.
Yes, yeah. The town owns roughly 1,800 acres of land that's permanently protected by state law to be used only for conservation. That means for trails, but otherwise, so we can put trails on them, and we can maybe do some farming. We know that Landsake uses some of our conservation, farm fields for farming, but generally speaking, they're meant to be protected as natural open space for wildlife, for water protection, and for, peace and quiet.
Yeah. Great. Tell me a little bit about your department,
Yeah.
and you work with a conservation commission. Tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about their role and
Sure.
how you
Sure.
interact with them.
Sure. So we have these two missions. One is to administrate, wetlands protection laws, local and state, and we have this other one of protecting our open space and managing it. So we have our 7 members Conservation Commission, which is appointed by the Board of Selectmen. Sorry.
Yep.
They have the Select Board. Said that wrong. The Select Board. And each Conservation Commissioner has a 3-year term. They tend to overlap, right? They hold regular public hearings or public meetings. And a lot of that time is taken up with looking at permit applications, but a fair amount, especially in Weston, is taken up with talking about land management issues, or just challenges or projects, mowing our fields, maintaining our trails, battling invasive plants. Once the invasive plants are removed successfully from an area, maybe trying to repopulate or reintroduce native alternatives, native species to those areas. So there's a lot of cool things that we can do. And that 7-member appointed Conservation Commission is integral to that. They bring a lot of value. I mean, in my role, I'm here sort of as the technical expert, and I have a lot of experience that I've gained here in Weston, but also previously in my career. But they really are helpful. I mean, they're residents. They're volunteering as a conservation commissioner because they have a love of the open space. They see the value in protecting wetlands and preserving the town's natural character, and they just want to do good public service.
Now, do they have to be schooled in certain things before they can be a conservation commissioner?
It's a good question. Not necessarily. Of course, it's helpful, and I think every sort of person in my position, every conservation administrator wants a conservation commission that has a variety of skills. It's helpful if someone has experience with, wetland delineation, for example, or, site plan review.
Yeah, but that's
or
hard to find.
Very hard to find,
Yeah.
or, stormwater management, right? But generally speaking, that's very hard to find. So we look for folks, and we encourage folks to apply that, again, have a passion for the outdoors, see the value in protecting our open spaces. And the sort of the day-to-day of being on a conservation commission, how to look at someone's, like for example, a plot plan or a site plan of someone's property and understand what they're proposing to do, how that might impact the wetland. That can come with experience. Generally I find that a conservation commissioner, when they join the commission, maybe is a little stands back a little bit, maybe is a little quiet, sort of observes, learns what types of questions can I ask.
Yep.
You get to know the regulations, you get to know the kind of the parameters with which you can review things, and then you start getting more actively involved. So, and that's kind of how it works. I think most towns have a variety of people that just want to do good work and want to get involved, to people that actually are like wetlands. Some towns actually have wetland scientists and engineers and attorneys and other people that, like land use attorneys and other people that have an expertise in the field. But generally speaking, you just roll up your sleeves, you learn on the job, and you can be
hopefully
helpful.
you make good decisions for the town.
And you just do the best you can to make good decisions for the town. And it's my job to help advise them and give them the information they need to make those decisions.
So recently you folks spent a lot of time working on the local wetlands protection bylaw. What's next for conservation? What are the big projects that you folks are looking at?
It's a great question.
What are the things that your commission has as a priority that they would like to work on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the passing the wetlands bylaw was a huge milestone, and we're proud of that. We spent the better part of this past year drafting regulations that would accompany that bylaw. So that was a huge step too. So now we're really looking at how can we manage the land better. There's a couple of, I would say, sort of two things I can mention. The first being that the state has a sort of a required plan that communities adopt called an open space and recreation plan that helps both the Conservation Commission, the Recreation Commission, but just the town in general, plan for, sort of do strategic planning around its conservation recreation assets, recreation fields and facilities, et cetera, conservation land, trails, et cetera, land acquisitions. It helps you set your priorities. That plan we did in Weston in 2017 and is just expiring now. So I think the conservation director, Chris Fitzgerald, and myself will be getting together to talk about sort of getting that plan updated, right? And that's a public process. There's a survey. There's lots of ways for the public to get involved and help us set our goals.
Lots of public meetings and hearings.
Yeah, exactly.
And the like.
One thing that we sort of just did, but it's just relevant to kind of how we look at managing the land, is that our open meadows are hugely important. We have like 30 open meadows in Weston that we manage. A lot of folks that use our conservation land would be familiar with some of them. French Field in Jericho. Forest, 80-acre field at Cat Rock, the one that surrounds Hobbs Pond, where a lot of people walk their dogs. There's a few beautiful, like the orchard on Concord Road, that's part of college land. And there's these beautiful, iconic meadows around town. They take a lot of work. The thinking around how to manage them has evolved over time. It used to be...
So you're not trimming it down to like golf course green?
Well, we're not. But depending on, for example, how much invasive plant pressure there is, how much woody growth is coming in, we might try to mow in July and then again in late fall. If it's a pretty intact meadow, let's say there's low invasive plant pressure, it's mostly native plants, and it's in fairly good shape, we might only mow once in late fall, as late as possible. The idea with these fields is we want them to be available for passive recreation, for trails, for the scenic value, or the kind of historic or pastoral value to Weston, but also the value to the wildlife, the invertebrates, the native pollinators, and the mammals, and the birds of prey that use those meadows. So it's a challenge. The thinking is always evolving on how to do it. So we just completed a new sort of guidance document or guideline for Weston that the commission adopted this past winter to help us manage those fields better. And then the other thing I'll mention is for decades now, Weston has run a very small sustainable forestry program. Most people will be familiar with it through purchasing firewood or cordwood from Landsake from the program. But the program has much loftier goals. There's climate resilience. There's obviously natural resource protection. There's just creating a more healthy forest. And that program has existed now for like 4 decades. And not to try to keep this high level and not too far into the weeds, but when we started the program in like 1980, the forest was what we call middle-aged. Most of the trees in Weston were, let's say, between 40 and 60 years old. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact. Now, 40 years later, these forests are between, let's say, 80 and 100 years old. And our management approach sort of needs to change because the forest has just matured. And there's different ways of thinking about that. There's a much more of a focus now, obviously, on climate resilience mm-hmm. and mitigation. There's a more of a focus now on preserving and protecting bird habitat and just looking more at the ecology of it, while at the same time, if possible, being able to do some amount of sustainable timber harvesting for local use. We feel, at least on the Conservation Commission, that there is great focus and great attention put on local food, but not so much on local wood. And that's something that we consume a great deal of in this country and in Weston, right? So we feel that if possible, we should be able to extract a tiny amount from Weston itself for use in Weston. But
it's also healthier for the forest.
Correct.
If you do some of that.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So, back in the day, like I said, we've got a fairly even-aged forest, and that's just because, when the farms in Weston were abandoned and, when sort of the town started to get developed, the forest was let to, regrow all kind of the similar age. And like anything, it's not good to have a homogeneous anything really, right? So you want a variety of ages and species, and so you can do that through forestry, and we feel that we can do it in a sustainable way in Weston.
Forestry diversity.
Correct.
Sounds
That's
good.
It. Yeah.
So you've said a couple of times about invasive plants.
Yes.
You spend a lot of time dealing with bittersweet and knotweed and those sort of
Correct.
things.
Yeah, so that's another big focus, and I would say the main focus of our land management program just happens to be invasive plant management, as it is for all of my colleagues in every other town in Massachusetts and in New England and in the world. They're a huge challenge. Invasive plants tend to displace native plants. They provide very little, if no value, to our local wildlife. They tend to have no natural predators, so they don't have the same kind of check and balances that our native plants do, that allow us to have a sort of a healthy, balanced ecosystem. So that's another thing, is I and my staff are always trying to keep up with the best science and sort of the best approach to how to manage these plants in a way that's affordable for Weston and that makes sense. And it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I got you.
And it's never ending.
Trust me, as someone who has to regularly get rid of the bittersweet on my property, it's almost every other week situation.
Yes.
It's awful.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you, what are some of the things that you get asked all the time that you wish the people of Weston knew about you or your department?
It's a good question. So a couple of, I don't want to say, just risks to being outside, okay? Poison ivy, ticks, and depending on the season, coyotes. And my message will be that poison ivy is not an invasive plant. It's certainly a nuisance plant, and we do try to manage it in areas where it is like overgrowing the trails.
Yep.
But generally, and ticks too, they are a huge public health risk and hazard. But coyotes too, at certain times of year, can at least appear to be aggressive because they're protecting their pups, particularly in the spring, right? But all of these factors are sort of message and approaches that, and this is how all of my colleagues in other towns and how the state is asking us to approach these risks, is to just educate people on how to identify them and how to live with them, right? learn how to identify poison ivy and stay away from it. It's ever present now, especially in our meadows. It's growing in our trails. We realize that. But generally speaking, we're not going to go out and herbicide all of our trails.
Because there's health risks and environment risks for doing so.
Absolutely, and it's just a never-ending. It's just so present now with ticks too. We try to keep like the trails that go through big fields. We try to keep them sufficiently wide. We do our best to keep them mowed in the summer, but it's a challenge, and people need to, when they're out on our conservation land. And it's tick season, go home, check yourself, be able to identify what does a tick look like, and just be sort of vigilant, self-vigilant. And coyotes too, I mean, the state advises us, or the guidance that we get from the Department of Fish and Game, or, Mass Fish and Wildlife, is that coyotes are wildlife. Wildlife are protected in Massachusetts. If they're more active, they may have pups. The mothers are more actively looking for food, et cetera, and being a little bit more protective. So that's why sometimes you'll see a sign out that says "Coyote Den near. We suggest you leash your pet," for example.
Yep.
And it's just about being aware of, we share this land with other creatures, and there's other factors at play that we can't control, and we just have to learn to live with them, but in a safe way.
Tell me about coyotes. Do we have a lot of coyotes in Weston?
So it's hard. I don't know the exact population, but we get reports. There's a couple of key areas in town where they seem to be more active. In College Pond, for example, down on the south side of town at a property called Hubbard's Woods. So they're there and they're active when they're active, but generally we do not see them. They are not attracted to humans. They really don't want to be around us.
I don't blame them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but they're wildlife in Weston. Yeah.
Any last comments that you might want to have for the people at home?
So I'll just put a plug in because I'm full time. I have 3 part-time staff that help me with different aspects. There's wetland permitting and there's land management and just administrative work to help me run the department. The 3 of them are roughly 1 full-time equivalent, a little less. But we manage almost 2,000 acres of land. We run multiple programs. We've got a very the permitting load the volume is high in Weston, right? I mean, people do a lot of work in this town and improve their homes, et cetera. So what I'm trying to get at is that we need volunteers to help. We run a monthly Stewardship Saturday program on the 3rd Saturday of every month, not in July and August, but September through June. We get great participation. We do things like trail building, invasive plant work.
Yeah.
Every February, we gather and help prune our orchard on Concord Road. People learn a little thing, people learn something, they get their hands dirty, and they help out, improving something that we all use. So
if somebody watching this was interested in participating, how would they volunteer?
So the easiest way would just be to email conservation@westonma.gov, and that goes directly to me. But on our website, right on the, westonma.gov/conservation, you'll see a tag right there for Stewardship Saturdays. And it usually will be updated with our next project.
Great.
That's it. Yeah.
Jordan, thank you very much for sitting in and joining me for the program. And to the people of Weston, I just want to say thank you for joining us and spending a little bit of time with us. And I will see you next time under the cupola.